South Africa has not announced whether it will arrest Russian President Vladimir Putin when he arrives in the country later this year. In fact, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandor, has consistently defended South Africa's relations with that country. Now, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Putin for war crimes over his invasion of Ukraine. For more on this, we're joined this morning by Gustavo de Carvalho. He is a researcher on Russia-Africa ties at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gustavo, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on to our program. So, Naledi Pandor says South Africa and Russia are old friends. What do you make of that kind of statement insofar as this arrest warrant by the ICC?
There has certainly been, thank you very much for having me, and there certainly has been in the last year an attempt from the South African government to really show this idea of being a non-aligned country in the sense of that is not taking sides in the conflict. Certainly the meetings that we've had yesterday between Naledi Pandor and senior officials from Russia really shows that idea of being on a line is becoming more and more difficult to sustain, particularly in the sense of the fact that there's been a lot of signs that South Africa is being very close, and I think that the statement from Naledi Pandor shows it quite well. That being said, I think South Africa is in a very difficult position right now when legally and especially after the al-Bashir saga in 2015 and the ruling of the Supreme Court of Appeal in 2016 showing that South Africa would have to fulfill its legal obligations to arrest Vladimir Putin, which seems to me that the response is not going to be a legal response, it's going to be a political one. South Africa will most likely issue an invitation for Vladimir Putin to come to South Africa to the BRICS summit in August. Now, the question is, will South Africa be engaging with the Russians to ask them behind closed doors whether they will be coming to South Africa or not? That I think it's the big question for us to be seeing in the next couple of months.
Is that sort of a slap in the face for this ICC arrest warrant then, Gustavo, if South Africa does go ahead and issues that invitation for Vladimir Putin, no matter what happens behind the scenes? Because if he shows up on South African soil for the BRICS summit and we do what we did with Bashir, what does that say?
Certainly, I think the big question now, if Vladimir Putin comes to South Africa, it's certainly a legal one and fulfilling rulings that have done by South African courts. South Africa is a signatory of the International Criminal Court statute, the Rome statute, and it has ratified, it has internalized, it has domesticated those into internal law. So if Vladimir Putin were to come to South Africa in August, certainly there is going to be a legal matter. Now, it also shows to me that the biggest loser of all of that doesn't seem to me to be Vladimir Putin himself. It is countries like South Africa. It is a country like Brazil next year, because we need to remember that Brazil is also one of the two countries within BRICS that have ratified the International Criminal Court. So the question there will be, what is the future of this particular court? What will happen internally in terms of the different political forces and how that's going to lead and interact with our own legal system in the coming months?
Yeah, I was actually that was my next question. You know, there's the legal issues for South Africa if indeed Vladimir Putin does arrive on home soil here in our country. But it's really a show of force, isn't it, on the part of Vladimir Putin for him to be able to sort of sashay into the country with no worries?
It would certainly be a show of force of Vladimir Putin to come, but it also would be an interesting sign in terms of where does the friendship between Russia and South Africa stands. I think South Africa is the one that has most to lose if Vladimir Putin is in South Africa, particularly in terms of the internal debates and the internal questionings that would happen. So that politically between South Africa and Russia, they would have to also consider, and for us here within the country, would help us also understand what is the role of South Africa in these global geopolitical disputes and the risks that we've become a pawn within global geopolitical disputes, in the sense of what is going to happen internally for the country in a space where we already have a lot of political crisis happening and a lot of eyes into the 2024 elections. So we do need to consider that, and it will be really important for us to also assess in terms of where does South Africa stand in this idea of that it's presenting as a non-aligned country and will remain as a non-aligned country in the coming months.
Yeah. And South Africa has really been holding that line, haven't they? The fact that they say, they will always call for mediation insofar as Russia's invasion of Ukraine is concerned. But it's starting to, and there's been a lot of pressure. There's been a bit of embarrassment from some organizations in South Africa, given government stance on Russia's war in Ukraine. Even the visit by the Belgian royals to South Africa, there was an incident where one of the officials in that contingent put it to Cyril Ramaphosa and said, when Russia does visit your country, will you put more pressure on your friend? I'm sort of paraphrasing what the question was that was put to Cyril Ramaphosa. He then answered very quickly and kicked the media contingent out of the room. But there is that sort of, shall we call it embarrassment on the part of South Africa in some ways?
There is, I think, more than an embarrassment. I think there is a search for a clear narrative around that. I think South Africa has showed quite a few mixed signals in the last year when it comes to its own position to the conflict. South Africa started by condemning the war and then changing slightly its positions throughout the next month. Certainly officially it still condemns the war, but it is looking for a particular type of approach that is much more focused on mediation and conflict resolution from the United Nations side. This does show, and with this increasing tension at a global sphere, that countries like South Africa, countries like most African countries, countries in Asia, countries in Latin America, have been finding quite difficult to navigate around that. So I do understand that specifically in the context of South Africa, there is an understanding of what, as you mentioned, a potential embarrassment around that. But countries in the global south have really struggled to put a position that in a way showcases a type of independent foreign policy. So in that sense, it goes way beyond just Vladimir Putin himself and goes way beyond South Africa-Russia relations. There is a concern from many in the global south that we have been used as a pawn within global geopolitical disputes. And I think irrespective of the ruling of the International Criminal Court in terms of the illegal movement of populations in Ukraine to Russia, there is a question of how do we make sure that we're not being instrumentalized, neither by Russia or by other parties of the conflict. And that is quite hard to do. That shows that issues about ensuring that our national interests are very clear and well presented to our population, that positions are presented in a way that does not show so much of this idea of South Africa being on the fence. And I think that it's probably the crucial point within this discussion is that how South Africa develops a narrative that showcases that it's not just simply cozying up to Vladimir Putin and to Russia. And I think South Africa has tried to show that, but also many of other actions, including the recent military exercise with Russia and China, gave that difficult sense for it to do. So it's important that a very clear communication strategy, a kind of an approximation not only with Russia but also with its other partners, because if South Africa is showing that we are non-aligned to this and we are able to develop different partnerships and friendships with other countries, it needs to in a way showcase that it's close to its old ally, its old friend, as Minister Pandor mentioned yesterday, but it also remains with its proximity with its Western partners.
Yeah, especially given South Africa's own history during the apartheid struggle. So, Gustavo, as we end off our interview, are you saying in some ways that South Africa may be in a difficult position, South Africa and the other parts of the world that you mentioned, insofar as outright condemning Russia and Vladimir Putin?
I think right now the global south is probably the biggest loser in terms of the geopolitical debate. And I'm not saying, of course, the biggest loser in that sense is the country that is being affected by the war, Ukraine. But when it comes to global geopolitics, I think the global south is in a really difficult position. South Africa does need to make it clear. South Africa does need to present its position more upfront and more proactively. But at the end of the day, it does create a very important reflection that we need to have is that how do we distance ourselves from conflicts that are not ours, and to make sure that we do not end up getting the most difficult part of the bargain, that it's actually being seen as an unreliable partner by all.
Gustavo de Carvalho, thanks so much for your time this morning. He's a researcher with the SA Institute of International Affairs, as we continue to build up to what South Africa will do when Vladimir Putin does arrive here for the BRICS summit later this year.